Okay, we've been talking about Ephesians for a while, studying this book. I think it's a great book. It's been a blessing to me to think about it again. It's so practical. It's so useful. It speaks to us in terms of who we are and what we ought to be. Mostly we've done this on Sunday nights. You'll excuse me this morning. We're going to bleed over a bit today. We've been looking at the last part of this book. We are drawing to a close. The last half, we divide the book up into chapters, of course, but the last three chapters are sort of grouped together by the first words of chapter 4 and verse 1. Walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you were called, as the old translation says. Walk worthy. It's about the way we live, the choices that we make from day to day. And we're looking particularly, we're going to be in chapter 6 today, but if you back up a bit, that's a part of a larger section that really begins up here in 5:18, excuse me, where Paul writes that we ought never to be filled with wine, wherein is excess, but rather be filled with the Spirit. Let the Spirit of God fill you. And I think there's several ways in which the Spirit of God will show itself. If it fills us, it will do several things for us. One of those things is, verse 21, that you will learn to submit yourselves to one another in the fear of God. And he makes several applications of that. Some of that relates directly to the home. And so we looked in previous lessons about wives. The next verse is, submit yourselves to your own husbands as to the Lord. We made the point. People have said, well, how does that go together? Some have even tried to suggest that verse 21 is this libertine passage that says we don't answer to anybody. Nobody's in charge of anybody. We're all just independent. And then the very next verse says, wives, submit. That can't be the meaning of that. Children, obey your parents. That cannot be the idea that nobody's in charge of anybody. What he's saying when he says, wives, submit, when he says there, submit yourselves to one another, he's calling us to submit our will, that is to say, our life to the best interest of others. And when you marry, and marriage is a good idea if it's done with the light of God's wisdom, when you marry, that's going to call on a wife to submit to her husband's leadership. And it's going to call on a husband to lead his wife. That's a form of submission too. Because there are times when it's not very much fun to lead. And if we're going to be any kind of leaders in our home, we're going to realize quickly, hopefully before we take up the role. Let me tell you, there are going to be times when there are things that fall on you that are not pleasant. And you're going to have to maybe even be willing to broach conflict because you know something is right and this is the best thing. It can be a lonely road. But all this is a part of what he calls on us to do. We said in another lesson that when you look down and boil down this story here in verses 22 through 33 of chapter 5, he's making a clear parallel between the families God set it up and our relationship with Christ. And he does make that point. Wives, submit yourselves as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. And the husband is called on to love his wife as Christ loved the church. But then when he comes down here in verse 33, verse 32 reads, this is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ of the church. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. I think we made this point. I meant to if I didn't. I've read a number of books on family and on the idea of marriages and so on through the years and how we can have a better marriage. And people who have respect for the Bible, they can write some good things in helping us apply these principles. But you know what they always come back to? Even those not written by religious people. That a successful marriage is going to be based upon a husband who loves his wife. That's what the book says. A wife who feels loved and cherished. And a husband who feels respected by his wife. That's what the book says. And that is still so true. So many relationships are greatly damaged and land upon the rocks because they fail to do those two things. We didn't spend a lot of time on this particular point, but I think we can certainly see in looking to apply these things. How is it that a wife can show respect for her husband? By following his direction. Within the realm of what's right, following his direction, and doing so without saying, I told you so, if he's wrong, because he's going to be wrong sometimes. All of those things are a part of showing respect and reverence for a husband. Not treating him as a child, not interrupting him, failing to listen when he speaks. That's just common courtesy to anybody. But it certainly can be a sign that we don't have much respect for a husband if we don't speak to him or don't listen to him as we should. Not, as one fellow said, not nagging. What in the world does that mean? Nagging doesn't mean that there's never a time for criticism. But there's the idea of a criticism or an instruction or a request that tears down and one that builds up. You know that. And so she's going to be thoughtful about how she interacts with her husband, to never send any message except that I do respect you and where you are and the place you occupy. Well, how about a husband loving his wife? Well, he loves his wife by showing, obviously, loyalty to her, by showing an honesty to her, by a kindness in how he speaks to her. And that includes not only volume or the lack thereof, but what he says and the words that he chooses, how he speaks about her. If he remembers to give thanks and praise for the good things, that works in both situations. There are all kinds of things. The quality time that he gives her shows that he does cherish her and she feels cherished. You've got a husband that feels respected in his relationship and the wife that feels cherished. That's going to make it easier for everything else. So that's what the book says. If you want to serve God, start in your home. Start with your husband or with your wife. And let that be the beginning, the foundation of many other things. You know, children also come into this picture as well. And we looked, I think, last time at 6 and verse 1. It is a natural progression. If you have a married couple that you're going to have children, it's a blessing. It's I think the most reachable way we can have an impact on this world. You know, we might be over here just one little fella and who knows me and what good can I do? Well, more than we think sometimes, I'm sure. But as we have children and rear them up to know God, and that's another generation, then another generation, we can really impact the world in a positive way. And so children, he calls on the children themselves to obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it might be well with thee, that thou mayest live long on the earth. And fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. We were talking about this section last time. Obedience is that idea of listening under another. It's this suicidal, crazy view, self-destructive view that the world has, that children ought to be brought up almost like partners without any sense of their having to take direction from anybody. You know, we don't want to tell you what to do. Let me tell you, children need somebody to tell them what to do. And they need someone to be an authority figure for their sake, so that they might find some sort of security and happiness. Obey in the Lord. I believe in the context here that relates to the obedience. That is, we are to obey as far as God's word allows, until we would come into a situation where we cannot submit to parents and violate the law of God. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Not just because it's traditional or because it's easy, but because we are people of principle and we believe and understand that this is the right thing. This is what God designed. He says, honor your father and mother. We talked about this also last time. And the idea of showing deference to them, of estimating them as of importance. As a young person growing up in someone else's household, obviously that involves the idea of taking a very day-to-day direction from our parents. But even as we get older, even as we might have a home of our own, there's still an obligation to honor in various ways. The Lord was the one who took this passage in Matthew 15, it's recorded, and shamed the Jews of his day because they did not take care of their elderly parents. Instead found other ways to get around that and just leave them to whatever situation they find themselves in. This is not honoring parents, and it's not acceptable. So, honoring actually has quite a broad application, that it might be well with you. Originally, if you look back in Exodus and Deuteronomy, the promise was that you will live long in the land, and that is in the land of Canaan. But the Lord, obviously, in quoting this passage, it recognizes the fact that long after they had taken Canaan and lost Canaan and returned to Canaan, that there was still an application of this. He applies it, Paul does, applies it to living long on the earth. It's not a suggestion that automatically, for example, if you find someone who dies young, well, they must not have treated their parents right. That's not the lesson we learn from this. But it's a better life, and it leads to generally a longer life if we are those who can take direction early. It is not a mere coincidence that so many young people who grow up rebels die young. We all understand that inherently. Now, we also, at least I believe we began, a look here at the responsibility on the other side of the equation about parents. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And the idea of not provoking to wrath, as one translation put it, do not make your children bitter about life. The parallel passage in Colossians chapter 3, fathers, provoke not your children to anger lest they be discouraged. Literally, unless you take the spirit out of them, the passion out of them. And there's the job of the parent, as we said, to break their will without breaking their spirit. What does that little phrase mean? It means something very profound. That is, my job as a parent is to teach my child that they're not in charge, that they need direction. But at the same time, we don't want to just obliterate them so that they are left scarred. There's an art to this. There's work to this. It is a challenge. I've said many times, and I still believe it to be true, being a parent is the most humbling job that I've ever had. And I think my kids turned out okay. But I still tell you, it's the most humbling job I've ever had. And I don't care who you are, the best of us are going to make mistakes. And we're going to have days when we just realize we've not done well. We may realize sometime later that we neglected something, so we understand this is a challenge. Meet the challenge. It's worth it. But make sure in being an authority figure, which we must be, that we are not so oppressive as to crush our children. How do we do that? I think we talked about some of this last time. By acting arbitrarily. That's one way you can just crush the spirit of a child. They don't know what to expect from day to day. Ideally you have the rules and you know where the boundaries are, and you know what's right, you know what's not right. But maybe in my household it just depends on how I woke up that morning. And some days I'm so grouchy and I just cannot be pleased about anything. And other days I just let everything go and the child does not know what's going on or which end is up. This will lead to problems. We all can see that. Being unfair with our children is also critically dangerous, I believe. We're not willing to listen to them. We're not willing to be willing to treat them as people. It's a bad thing when a child is regularly humiliated, unnecessarily so. It's one thing for a child to come to recognize that they don't run the house. They need to know that. but they don't need to feel worthless. And people can say the most awful things to their kids. And they think kids won't remember. They do. They do. I've told some of you before this story. My mom died when she was 89. And I guess to the last year of her life, she can remember her dad died young and they got parceled out for a little while amongst the relatives. Some of the things that were said to them, not by their parents, not by her parents, but by relatives, were things that stuck with her all those years. I don't think she was a bitter person, but she never forgot it. Be careful what you say and how we talk to our kid. It's important to keep that in mind. To be partial in the way that we deal with our children. If we have multiple children, the story of Isaac and Rebekah, it doesn't take a PhD in child psychology to see the seeds of that family were sown, the problems they were sown by the parents. Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. Isaac loved. Now, we understand that God was working a plan there too. We all know that, but God could have worked his plan without all the heartache and trouble that came too. That was the human touch there that God used ultimately to work a purpose. But it's a sad picture. It still happens. Of course it happens. And so we can provoke our children by unfair behavior. Now, let me say this. I heard an old football coach say one time he didn't have favorites. He treated the players like they made him treat them. And that's true. And, if you have a child who chooses to be a rebel, they're not going to have the same experience that another child will have. That's right. That's right. But every child that grows up in my house needs to feel like they're loved and they're important and that they have a chance. And if they lose that feeling, then that is a very bitter pill for them to swallow. And I think sometimes we, as parents, can just fail to remember that our children are growing up. I remember being rather crushed one time when I took the girls out one day and they didn't want to go to the Disney store anymore. This was a surprise to me. It should not have been. You ought not to treat children as if they're still 5 years old when they're long past that. And this can have serious consequences if it applies in other situations. And also, I think we can certainly be in danger of discouraging our children if we are uncontrolled in our behavior. I've said before that the Proverbs do teach us that there is, I think, a place for corporal punishment in the rearing of children. Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 18, chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not thy soul spare for his crying. It might hurt a little bit if he gets a spanking or she gets a spanking. But it might help them remember that no means no, and it might be a great blessing to them later. It won't kill them if they feel a little bit of that pain. If thou beatest him with a rod, he shall not die. Beat him with a rod and save his soul from hell. And sometimes it is the fact that I just don't have the heart or the energy to do that I let things go that I should not and don't punish when I should. And the result of that is that I'm loving myself and I'm doing the child a disservice. But having said that, I'll say this, that as we punish our children, it ought to always be with that spirit in mind, that we are looking to help the child, to correct their behavior. Discipline is not just fighting with your children. It's never fighting with your children. It is always controlled, never in a fit of temper or a fit of anything else. I think about that passage in 1 Corinthians 11. This is not in the context of rearing children, you understand. But in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul makes an important point, I think, about the nature of discipline. Paul writes there in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 31, if we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened of the Lord. There's the idea of discipline. We are chastened of the Lord, that we should not be condemned with the world. You know what chastening is in its purest form? It's the idea of trying to keep our children from being condemned with the world. That's what God does for us. And so it's always purposeful, and there's always a larger goal in mind here. It's not just an uncontrolled fit. I'm in a bad mood. You step on my foot, I'll hit you on the head. That type of thing is not acceptable. It's not discipline. Far from it. It leads, I think, to damage and not good for our children. Instead, he says, bring them up. Bring them up. Rear them up. Lead them up. Develop them, in other words. It's purposeful. You know, my parenting must not be a daily accident. There's no plan here. I just wake up every day, and it has to always come with this idea of mine. I'm working toward a goal. I'm looking to help my child. And I'm also conscious of the fact that there are certain lessons they've got to learn in my house before they leave here, or they're going to be hurting. And so it's rather school when you think about it. We talk about homeschooling. I hope every parent's schooling at home. They may not all be teaching math, but I'll tell you, we all be teaching a lot of things that are more important than math. All due respect to our math teachers here. But there are things a lot more important than math, as you know. We're teaching our children about honesty and about modesty and about hard work and about reverence and about caring for other people and about how to talk, how not to talk. All those are things they need to see in us and they need to hear from us. But how many children in this world do you think receive that kind of training? What percentage would you put on it? I don't know. I don't think it'd be 90%. And how many children that grow up in the homes of Christians are receiving the kind of purposeful training that they need? I hope a lot. But it's not 100%. It takes work to do what we're asked to do here. It is a sacrifice. You know, there are a lot of reasons why people don't have children. You understand that. I understand that. But we have a spirit in this world that I believe has taken hold of a generation that says, that's too much work and I want to do what I want to do. Well, they got one thing right. It is work. But it is also a work that's worth it. But it will take sacrifice. We expect that as fathers and mothers. It's the opposite, all of it, of selfishness. And failing to follow through with what God asks us to do here is really the root of every form of evil in this world, nearly. I found this. I like to buy books. I buy used books a lot. I got one sent to me in the mail here. I don't even remember what book this came out of now. But obviously somebody was using it as a bookmark. If you can't tell, it's a little heart. I think I may have stuck it in here. So it's just about like this. It's a little heart. It looks like to me, when you read it, it's written by a child, and it looks like a prayer request to me. That's what I'm guessing it was, on this little heart-shaped paper. And what it says, as best I can decipher it, is this: help my dad, help my best friend's mom to stop hitting her and to stop doing drugs. Help my friend Amy to stop smoking because she is only 9. And then she signs her name. Well, maybe this is not the most horrible thing you've ever read, but it's sort of a reminder There are kids who grow up and they deal with stuff they have no business dealing with. And they see stuff they shouldn't see. Okay. My job is a parent. I can't fix everything in the world, but I can fix my house. And that's what we're doing. Now, look, if I have failed in some way in the past, I don't have a time machine, okay? But I tell you what I can do. I can be forgiven, and I can go forward, and I can help others, sometimes with the things I did right, sometimes with the things I did wrong. But God help us, and I'm talking primarily to the young families here. God bless you for what you're trying to do, and don't forget how important it is, and don't forget the great responsibility and the great blessing that's been given to you. Bring them up in the nurture of the Lord, the training, the education of the Lord, the correction, as one lexicographer put it. I think we use that term quite a bit. You know, that word correction, I think, is a navigational term. I don't fly a plane. I can barely drive a car. But for those who maybe chart a course, it could be a plane or some other, could be a car, I suppose. They have a course set, and they're going to go from A to C here. B represents where they are. Well, the guy didn't start out right, did he? It didn't look so bad down here, just a little bit of just a slight variation from the course. But of course, the further he goes, obviously, the further away he gets from where he's supposed to be. So what is he going to have to do? He's going to have to make a correction. And by the way, he may have to make several corrections. It is quite possible, not uncommon. But we've got to keep making corrections, otherwise we'll never get where we're headed. We understand exactly the picture. As parents, we have that obligation to teach our children, to make corrections and to help them understand how to make corrections and why it's important. To bring them up to the nurture, the correction of the Lord, the admonition, putting them in mind. That's really, I think, the basic idea there, to teach them and to instruct them about the Lord, to train them by words, as one fella put it, whether encouragement, remonstrance, reproof, according as is required. And where does all this come from? Well, you know, parents certainly are called on to do this, yes, but notice what Paul says. He says, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. They are mentioned here specifically. Maybe that's because they are the head of the family. That's not to neglect the role of mothers or to in any way denigrate it or to discount it. Far from it. But I think it's a good reminder how much we need fathers. Our society is very hateful to fathers. There's no question about that. Our government is hateful to fathers. They discriminate against fathers, I think, in all kinds of ways. This is a fact that we see around us in our legal system. But all of us as fathers need to remember the great opportunity and the great responsibility we have to do all we can in our lives and our words to let our children see Christ live in us. The government may make that very difficult, and society may make it very difficult. We're going to fight against that difficulty in every way we can because it's just too important to do anything else. I want to talk tonight about the idea of servants and masters and what in the world do we do with a passage like Ephesians 6 and verse 5 and following. We'll talk about that. We're heading toward this last section here of the whole armor of God, and then we'll be finished with our study on Ephesians. I do appreciate your kind words and your continued consideration of these things, and I hope and pray that we'll let this great book lead us and guide us as it should. If you haven't already, please take your songbooks out, turn to the number that's been selected. You're here as one who is a child of God. You need to obey, you need to in some way come back to God, return to Him. Please do so. If you have never obeyed the gospel, why not this morning? Why not this morning become a Christian? Take your place in the army of Christ and get to work for Him. Be baptized into Christ for the remission of sins based on your faith, your repentance, your confession of Jesus as the Lord and Christ. If that's your desire, we'd be glad to help you. Let us know how we can, please, while we stand, while we sing.